On the 26th of November, 1941, 6 aircraft carriers weighed anchor in Hitokapu Bay, a freezing, fog-covered inlet in the Kuril Islands at the northern edge of the Japanese Empire. Their radios were sealed. Most of the crews learned their destination only after they were at sea. The fleet turned east into the empty waters of the North Pacific, on a course for Hawaii. The men who sent them did not believe Japan could defeat the United States. They had run the numbers themselves, and the numbers said Japan would lose. What they believed instead was something stranger. They believed they would not have to win. They believed that if Japan struck hard enough, took enough, and held on long enough, America would decide the war was not worth fighting and quit. The pressure behind that gamble had a date on it. On the 26th of July, 1941, after Japanese troops occupied southern French Indochina, Washington froze Japanese assets and cut off trade. In practice, that ended Japan's oil supply. The United States had been providing roughly 80% of Japan's imported oil, and Japan imported nearly all of it. What remained was a stockpile, somewhere around 43 million barrels, and a fleet that burned it at close to 3,000 barrels an hour. The Navy's planners calculated the reserves would last about 18 months to 2 years. After that, the battleships would not move. The rest of the arithmetic was worse. In 1941, American steel mills produced almost 83 million tons. Japan's produced under 7 million. The American economy was more than 5 times the size of Japan's, and it was still mostly asleep. In July of 1940, Congress had passed the Two-Ocean Navy Act, authorizing 257 new warships, a 70% expansion of the American fleet. Japanese naval planners understood exactly what that meant. When those hulls entered service in 1943 and 44, no combination of skill and courage would matter. If Japan was ever going to fight, the window was now. And Japan's own experts had already looked through that window and reported what they saw. In the summer of 1941, the Total War Research Institute, a body created under the Prime Minister's office, ran a full simulation of a war against the United States and Britain. Teams played each of the powers. The conclusion was unambiguous. Japan could not win. The war would drag on. Japan's economy would be ground down, and eventually, the Soviet Union would enter the war against it. The Institute's recommendation was that war with the United States be avoided. Inside the Army, a research office under Lieutenant Colonel Jiro Akimaru, staffed with some of Japan's best economists, reached the same verdict. Akimaru said decades later that everyone in the military accepted the finding. Nobody said it out loud to the men at the top. The most senior voice of doubt belonged to the man who would plan the attack. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, had studied at Harvard and served as naval attaché in Washington. He had seen American factories with his own eyes. In the autumn of 1940, he told Prime Minister Konoe that if ordered to fight, he would run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but that he had utterly no confidence for the second or third year. In January of 1941, he put it even more bluntly in a letter. To actually defeat the United States, he wrote, taking Guam and the Philippines would not be enough, nor would Hawaii. Japan would have to march into Washington and dictate peace in the White House itself. It was a warning that the war was unwinnable. American propaganda would later turn it inside out and present it as a boast. Almost everything known about how Japan talked itself into this war comes from its own paperwork, the liaison conference records, the Institute's war game, the interrogations afterward. Documents like those are what War Shelf is built from, a library of short books on the Second World War, each one a single story read down out of roughly 10,000 pages of records. The link is in the description. On the 15th of November, 1941, 3 weeks before Pearl Harbor, the liaison conference between the government and Imperial General Headquarters adopted Japan's official plan for ending the war it was about to start. The document was called the Draft Proposal for Hastening the End of the War Against the United States, Great Britain, the Netherlands, and Chang. It laid out the sequence. Japan would destroy the American, British, and Dutch positions in East Asia, seize the oil and resources of the South, and build an invincible defensive perimeter around them. Then Germany and Italy would force the capitulation of the United Kingdom, and Britain's collapse, the plan stated, would discourage the United States from continuing the war. Against America directly, Japan would lure the Pacific Fleet into one decisive battle and destroy it, attack American shipping, and use propaganda to convince the American public that fighting on was futile. Read closely, the plan contained a hole at its center. The step that actually ended the war, Britain's surrender, was not a Japanese operation. It belonged to Germany. Japan's plan to end its war with America contained no action Japan itself could take to end its war with America. The rest rested on doctrine and on memory. Since 1907, Japanese naval planning had assumed that an American fleet would steam west across the Pacific, that Japan would whittle it down with submarines and night torpedo attacks along the way, and then annihilate what remained in one great battle, the way Admiral Togo had annihilated the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905. That war was the model for everything. Japan had fought a much larger power, hit it hard, held on, and then let a third-party broker a peace. Theodore Roosevelt had mediated the Treaty of Portsmouth. Nobody in the doctrine ever explained why an America that lost a fleet would negotiate rather than simply build another one. Underneath it all sat a judgment about American character. Japanese planners saw the United States as rich, soft, divided by faction and race and class, and unwilling to bleed for distant islands. In 1941, that judgment did not look foolish. American isolationism was a mass movement. On the 12th of August, 1941, the House of Representatives voted on whether to extend the draft, and it passed by a single vote, 203 to 202. On the 31st of October, a German U-boat sank the destroyer USS Reuben James with heavy loss of life, and America still did not declare war. From Tokyo, this looked like a country that would flinch. The men making the decision were not serene about it. On the 5th of September, the Emperor pressed Army Chief of Staff Sugiyama on how long the southern operations would take, and reminded him that in 1937 he had promised the China War would be over quickly. Sugiyama could only plead that China was vast. The next day, at the Imperial Conference that approved war preparations, the Emperor broke with convention, spoke, and read aloud a poem written by his grandfather, asking why the winds and waves of strife rage so turbulently across seas that should be as brothers. In October, Konoe made a last appeal to War Minister Hideki Tojo to pull back. Tojo answered that sometimes a man must close his eyes and jump from the veranda of the Kiyomizu temple. Konoe replied that a man might gamble with his own life that way, but not with a nation. Days later, Konoe resigned, and Tojo became prime minister. Even the Navy's chief, Admiral Nagano, would not promise victory. He told the throne the fleet could sustain operations for perhaps a year and a half, maybe 2 years. Beyond that, he offered nothing. On the 26th of November, Secretary of State Cordell Hull handed Japan's ambassadors a note demanding withdrawal from China and Indochina in exchange for restored trade. Tokyo read it as an ultimatum. That same day, Japan time, the carriers sailed from Hitakapu Bay. On the 1st of December, the Imperial Conference formally decided on war. By then, the plan's foundation was already cracking, and nobody in Tokyo knew it. On the 5th of December, 1941, 2 days before the strike on Pearl Harbor, the Red Army opened a massive counteroffensive in front of Moscow and threw the German army back. The Wehrmacht that was supposed to force Britain's capitulation was now freezing in retreat in the Russian snow. The single event Japan's war plan depended on was never going to happen. On the morning of the 7th of December, the aircraft of the 6 carriers struck Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's hope, beyond crippling the fleet, was psychological, a blow so stunning that the American public would recoil from a long Pacific War. The next day, Congress voted on war with Japan. The Senate passed it 82 to nothing. The House passed it 388 to 1. The country that 4 months earlier had kept its draft alive by a single vote was now unanimous within a single day. On the 11th of December, Germany declared war on the United States, the one piece of the November plan that came true. and it delivered American industry into the European War instead of removing it from the Pacific. For a while, the first phase ran ahead of schedule. Guam fell on the 10th of December, Wake on the 23rd, Hong Kong on Christmas Day. Manila fell on the 2nd of January. Singapore, the great British fortress, surrendered on the 15th of February, 1942. The Dutch East Indies, with their oil, capitulated on the 9th of March. Corregidor, the last American holdout in the Philippines, fell on the 6th of May. Japan had its perimeter and its resources, months ahead of plan. And in March, the Liaison Conference met to decide what came next, and produced a new outline for guiding the war, because the old one had no next step Japan could take. The empire was won. The mechanism for ending the war still did not exist. Then the timetable that mattered began to run. On the 18th of April, 1942, 4 months and 11 days after Pearl Harbor, American bombers appeared over Tokyo. In the first week of June, at Midway, Japan lost 4 of the 6 carriers that had sailed from Hittokapu Bay, sunk in a single day's fighting, 6 months and a day after Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto had promised to run wild for 6 months or a year. The running wild ended almost exactly on schedule. On the 7th of August, 1942, United States Marines landed on Guadalcanal. The Japanese Army staff had estimated the American counteroffensive would not begin until 1943. It began 8 months after Pearl Harbor, and behind it came the industry Japan had bet would never fully wake. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States built over 300,000 military aircraft. Japan built about 76,000. American yards launched more than 2,700 Liberty ships and cut the time to build one from 244 days to under 40. American submarines went to work on the 6 million tons of merchant shipping Japan's entire resource plan depended on. 1 million tons went down in 1942, 2 million in 1943, 4 million in 1944. The oil of the East Indies was Japanese, and it could not reach Japan. In January 1943, at Casablanca, Roosevelt announced that the Allies would accept nothing but unconditional surrender. The negotiated peace at the heart of Japan's plan was now formally impossible. Yamamoto did not live to see how it ended. On the 18th of April, 1943, American fighters intercepted his aircraft over Bougainville and shot it down. In the summer of 1945, its cities burning, Japan reached one last time for the 1905 playbook and sought a third party to broker peace, this time through Moscow. On the 9th of August, 1945, the Soviet Union answered by declaring war and invading Manchuria. It was precisely the outcome Japan's own war game had predicted 4 years earlier, in the summer of 1941, when the Total War Research Institute finished its simulation, concluded that Japan would lose, and filed the report with the men who went to war anyway.